Hey everyone, this is Climb by VSC, a weekly show covering the most exciting developments in the world of climate innovation. My name is Jake Kapoor, General Partner of VSC Ventures and co-host of Climb. Every week, I or a member of our VSC team will speak to a pioneer in the climate tech world about emerging technologies and novel ideas that will turn the tide on climate change. We've heard enough of the doom and gloom. It's time for stories about purpose-driven innovation that lead to sustainable, positive change. I'm so happy you've decided to join us. Now let's climb.
Hey everyone, welcome to Climb by VSC. My name is Maggie Philbin. I'm a partner at VSC and a guest host for today's episode on all things electric vehicles. I'm excited to be joined by my friend, Levi Tillemann, VP of Policy and International Outreach at Ample. Ample is a startup that's making charging your electric vehicle as fast and as convenient as going to a gas station through a new model that they call battery swapping. Levi is bringing a wealth of knowledge to us today as he's had 15 plus years experience on the policy side, working with the Department of Energy and the World Economic Forum. He's also the author of The Great Race. Levi, I have your book here. It's about the global quest for the car of the future. And I'm just so honestly honored that you're here. So welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, Maggie. And I would never pass up an opportunity for an extended conversation with you. So I'm looking forward to it. I think there's a lot happening in this space right now, and especially in the policy side of electric vehicles. So let's jump in.
Yeah, let's do it. I figure, why don't we actually just kick things off by looking back a little bit? I know that you come from a long line, multi-generations of your family being in politics, but for you, clean energy and electric mobility have always remained at the focus for your career. So I just figured, do you want to give us a little TLDR on where you are today and why the mobility space?
Sure. Yeah. So I was always fascinated with the natural world. When I was a kid, I spent probably way too much time at the local pond catching frogs and crayfish and turtles and studying ecosystems. And I think as a result, from a really young age, I was highly attuned to what was happening in terms of climate. And I can't remember a time when I didn't think that was a big problem. So I got involved with electric vehicles actually kind of through a side door. I had been working on a startup with my father, who was an inventor, on actually more efficient internal combustion engines. There was a lot of thought in the 2000s that biofuels were going to be a big part of the solution when it came to climate change. But as it became clear that biofuels were not likely to pan out in the way that some had predicted, I shifted my focus to electric vehicles. And I decided to write a PhD dissertation on industrial policy in the automotive industry, specifically focused on policies that drive socially beneficial innovation. And that's actually the topic of my book as well. So, today we are living in a really exciting time. I feel like a lot of the predictions that I made in my book, The Great Race, are coming true. The electric vehicles industry is about 20 times as big as it was when my book published. My thesis that industrial policy or government policies were going to drive a lot of the action in the electric vehicles space has played out again and again and again. And most recently in the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed this summer and is going to have a huge and long-reaching effect on the shape of the industry going forward.
Wait, I'm so curious. So if you could, maybe for our listeners who didn't have the chance to read your book, what were some of the predictions that you had and how are you seeing it fold out today?
Well, it's hard for people to remember this, but in 2014, when I finished writing my book, the electric vehicle industry was still very speculative. People didn't know if this was just a flash in the pan, if it was a momentary trend like NFTs or some of the other things that we've seen kind of rise and fall. And I said, no, this is the future. This is what's going to happen. Within decades, it's going to not just be a big industry, it's going to be the entirety of the automotive industry. We have an industry that is not only going to be electric, but increasingly it's going to move towards self-driving vehicles. And, not to say that cars are going to fully drive themselves, but they're going to be more and more robotic in the future. They're going to have more and more functionality that doesn't require a human to intervene in order to guide that vehicle. And fundamentally, this is going to be driven, not the self-driving part, but the electrification part, by the exigencies of climate change and government policy that is leaning on automakers to shift from internal combustion engines towards low and zero carbon replacements like electric vehicles.
And we have such big, ambitious goals in the US, globally, Europe. I mean, what do you think it's really going to take to move to a fully electric future?
Well, first of all, electric vehicles are fantastic. I have an electric vehicle. I love it. It has terrific acceleration. It has great performance in other ways. I just drove up to New Hampshire to see my grandma, and I took a non-electric vehicle because I didn't want to have to deal with the long charge times. And to me, that sort of gets at the tension that the industry is confronting today. I much prefer my electric car to the vehicle that I drove up to New Hampshire from Washington, D.C. But I knew that it just wasn't viable to drive two ways in a weekend and spend 4 or 5 or 6 hours of that drive charging as I was trying to get up the coast to New Hampshire to see my grandma. And so I think the thing about electric vehicles is they are a great product. They are definitely the future. They are being held back by charging technology today. And I think that there are a couple of other challenges in terms of making sure that we have enough resources to build the batteries that are required for electric vehicles in terms of rare earth elements and critical materials. But I think the biggest thing that is holding electric vehicles back today is fast, convenient, affordable charging. And Ample's solution of battery swapping is it's a way to address that challenge.
Wait, so if anyone's not, you should follow Levi on Twitter, because Levi, I really do see you poking the bear a little bit often about, your charging experience when you're on, waiting or they don't work. And it's just like a host of issues that I see you often complaining about on Twitter, but for good reason.
No. I'm not poking the bear. I'm trying to make our competition stronger so that we can all succeed together. I don't really see it as a competition between battery swapping and charging. I see it as a competition between electric vehicles that are much better in an ideal world for the environment and non-electric vehicles for which we have to extract the remains of ancient dinosaurs from the ground and burn them in our gas tanks, right? That's not exactly what we're doing, but effectively, it is fossil fuels against potentially clean electricity. And of course, not all the electricity that we use is clean today. Fossil fuels, some are dirtier, some are cleaner, but they all produce a lot of carbon emissions. And the challenge is to figure out how we can make those electric vehicles not just more fun and better performance and quieter and smoother to operate, but also more convenient, or just as convenient as those fossil fuel competitors that are very strong competitors. If fossil fuel powered vehicles weren't so good at what they do, then the electric vehicle industry would have an easier road ahead of it. But as is now, there's a lot of innovation that has to happen in order for electric vehicles to really take over the job of the internal combustion engine.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so let's go back to battery swapping, though, because I don't know if everyone that's listening knows about battery swapping. So can you just kind of give us an explanation of how it works and maybe why it's better?
Sure. So let me start with an introduction to how I charge my electric car, because I think a lot of people don't have electric cars. I think one of the challenges that I find when I'm talking with people about the industry is, electric vehicles probably are responsible for about 1% of the vehicle miles traveled in the United States today, which means the vast majority of people don't have a lot of experience driving electric cars. 99+% of the miles traveled are in non-electric vehicles. So people know what it means to refuel a non-electric vehicle. And a lot of people think that refueling an electric car or charging an electric car is going to be similar. Well, for me, I have to find a place to plug in my electric car. I don't have home charging. Most people in the United States, most cars in the United States don't have access to overnight home charging. So for me, usually what I do is I will drive 15 minutes away to a Walmart that has an Electrify America charging station. I pray, even though I'm not a particularly religious person, that there's not something wrong with the charging station, because frequently there is something wrong with a charging station. I plug it in, and in a best possible scenario, I'm going to wait 45 minutes for my electric vehicle to charge from a 20% charge to about an 80% charge. That means that I'm waiting the better part of an hour for roughly 60% of that battery to be charged. And in total, that battery has a 270 mile range. That is not sustainable for most people. I, as you can tell, am a diehard environmentalist. I am a diehard supporter of the industry, so I will deal with that inconvenience. But I think most people won't deal with that inconvenience. So what battery swapping is it's a way for people who aren't up for that challenge to have an electric vehicle charging experience that is as convenient, as seamless, and as affordable as gasoline, and ideally significantly more affordable than gasoline. What we do is you roll into something that looks a little bit like a car wash, and then robots come and they pull out your empty battery and they plug in a fresh battery, and that whole process takes about 10 minutes. By the end of next year, it should take about 5 minutes. And the idea is to basically give people a recharging mechanism that provides them with an experience that is very similar to the experience of filling up with gasoline. In fact, it's better, because with gasoline, you still have to get out, you have to punch in your credit card zip code, you have to mess with a dirty gasoline nozzle, sometimes you spill gasoline. With our battery swapping system, you don't touch anything. The robots do all of the work for you. It takes about the same amount of time as filling up with gasoline, and you're on your way. So that is what battery swapping is.
Oh, I love that. So what is it like when you're talking to cities and governments and you're trying to pitch them on why it's a good idea to have ample swapping stations on the corner, just like we would see a traditional gas station, or maybe just like we would want to see as many McDonald's, but with amples? Like, what has that process been like for you? What are you hearing? Are people excited about this? Are they skeptical?
Mostly it's a process of education. In the United States, battery swapping is not a large industry yet, which is different from some other countries around the world. So in China, there are already over 2,000 battery swapping stations. And that's a lot if you think about it within the context of industry. The US has about 100,000 gas stations. And a battery swapping station is kind of similar to a gas station in the number of vehicles that it can charge in a given day, because it's so much faster than normal electric vehicle charging. So sometimes you see numbers out there where people say there are now as many electric vehicle chargers as gas stations in the United States, or something like that. That's not a very good comparison, because it doesn't take you an hour to charge your vehicle at a gas station. But that is a pretty good comparison when you're looking at battery swapping stations compared to gas stations. So China already has about 2,000 of these really high volume battery swapping stations in country. Europe is also installing battery swapping stations, and Ample is really the tip of the spear for battery swapping in the United States. I'm not aware of any other company that is doing battery swapping in a serious way in the US. Though if you know of any, please reach out to me, because I'm always interested in good research.
So as we try to get more EVs on the road, and at the same time we're coming into this recession and cost cutting, and I think families are going to be a little more cost conscious. We're seeing it happen already with consumer spending. Do you think that's going to put America back a little bit as we head into this recession? Like, what do you think about that?
In terms of electrification?
Yeah.
That's a good question. It may, Maggie. I think that one of the big challenges is that the vehicle fleet turns over very slowly. The average vehicle on the road in the United States is more than 10 years old. And as a result, it takes a while for those old vehicles to go away and the new vehicles, potentially the electric vehicles, to replace those old gasoline powered vehicles. Today in the United States, the sales of electric vehicles still only account for sort of single digits in terms of the overall market share. So we have to do two things. First of all, we have to get that share way up. And secondly, we have to make sure that people are actually buying new vehicles. And thirdly, actually, we have to retire those old gasoline vehicles in a way that is economically and environmentally efficient. So in as much as people stop buying electric vehicles, that could be a problem for this transition away from fossil fuels. Now, there is a corollary to that, which is that in as much as people stop buying big gas guzzling internal combustion engine vehicles, that may actually be a good thing for climate change, right? Because that makes the ICE stock older. That means that as technology matures for electric vehicles and EV batteries get cheaper and they become more accessible, that when people start buying vehicles again, more electric vehicles are going to be purchased. And until we get to a point where electric vehicles account for the majority of vehicles sold, when you buy a new vehicle on average in the United States, you're still going to be contributing to that problem of internal combustion engine vehicles that spew out both pollution and global greenhouse gases.
Yeah. Wait, it was interesting at the top of that, you were saying that the US was lagging. Why does the US continue to lag against, let's say, Europe, who has exceeded us in terms of putting EVs on the road? Like, why is that? Why does that keep happening?
Yeah, I think it mostly comes down to policy. The EU has very aggressive fuel economy requirements that essentially force a certain amount of electrification. There's something else that people don't talk about very much, which is that the average plug in the United States puts out about 110, 120 volts of electricity. In Europe, the average plug puts out about 220 volts of electricity. So that means that you charge twice as fast in Europe when you plug into a normal socket. So their electric vehicles, from a charging perspective, are sort of automatically twice as good as an American electric vehicle. So I think that probably also has something to do with it. And then finally, Europeans are just broadly much less divided when it comes to the issue of climate change. I think most Europeans realize that this is an issue of survival. This is an issue of maintaining a healthy ecosystem, not just for animals and oceans, but for people, and that we all rely on each other. And we want to live in a world where you have that biodiversity, because at the end of the day, that supports not just ecological life, but human life. We are part of that ecosystem and we rely on that ecosystem.
What would you say are some things you're really proud of in terms of like cutting elbows, breaking through on some policy changes, or I don't know, just I guess what you're hearing as you're really going out and selling Ample?
We've had pretty spectacular success with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act. It was like Santa coming down the chimney for Ample. And I will explain what I mean when I say that. There were a lot of policies in the previous infrastructure bill that was being put together kind of right when I got hired by Ample and before we had really put together our policy strategy, that were not technology neutral. They basically said, we want this kind of plug, we want this kind of cord, it has to have this amount of power going through it. And from my standpoint, that was really bad policy. And the reason it was bad policy is because, again, 99% of the miles on our roads are not electrified. The kinds of technologies that are going to electrify that remainder, that remaining 99% of miles, are not necessarily the same technologies that were used to electrify the early adopters, right? And so we came to Washington, we made a very strong argument that it's important when you're passing these kinds of transformational pieces of legislation to realize that policymakers don't necessarily know what the future looks like. So you should do two things. You should incentivize performance. And secondly, you should have a technology neutral approach. What do I mean when I say incentivize performance? Well, broadly speaking, I mean, you should look at things that are actually going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in as much as that technology is cost efficient and does reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you should make that technology eligible for whatever programs you're rolling out. But secondly, kind of more concretely, you should look at the specific metrics that you want to achieve with respect to distinct technologies. So for instance, in the case of electric vehicles, what is the most important metric? It's vehicle miles traveled. We want to make sure that as many vehicle miles traveled as possible are transitioned from internal combustion engine vehicles to zero carbon electric vehicles. And you should incentivize the technologies that are able to do that most efficiently and most effectively. And battery swapping is actually a really great technology from that perspective, because the highest mileage drivers are people who can't afford to wait around for an hour while their electric vehicle charges. And so people like Uber drivers, taxi drivers, delivery people, they need something like battery swapping. They need something like Ample. And I think that those arguments really resonated with the offices that we worked with on Capitol Hill. And so they went the extra mile to make sure that A, these policies were technology neutral, and B, they even put some carve-outs in some of the bills that specifically incentivized fleet drivers, people who drive commercial vehicles, to go electric, more so than private individuals. And that's a good thing, because for a private individual, that car, that electric vehicle, is sitting fallow, unused 95% of the time. For a fleet vehicle, you are cranking out a lot of miles in that car. And so you want to make sure that that vehicle is electric, because that's the vehicle that's producing the most pollution and the most greenhouse gases. So we feel really proud about a lot of the provisions that made their way into the Inflation Reduction Act, and we can see our fingerprints all over that bill.
I'm so glad you brought it up, because that's one of the reasons why when you were coming, talking to us about your business, I thought it was so spot on to start with Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, because you really can relate to it. Like you see them, they're on the road, hundreds, sometimes thousands. You hear, I'm in the Bay Area, I hear people coming all the way from Sacramento just to go down to San Francisco because they're going to have, a better chance at making more money that day, and they're on the road. And I agree. Like, I don't personally have an electric vehicle one day, but my car just sits in the driveway. So I really can relate to that. I'm actually really curious too about how you went about, for other startup founders who are listening to, who are wanting to build out their policy teams. What does your team look like at Ample? Like, is it you and 10 others? How did you recruit for these folks? Like, do you have, people that you used to work with on Capitol Hill?
So I hired a lawyer who worked with me when I was at the Obama administration, and also has experience on the Hill and working on campaigns. And he also is extremely passionate about clean energy. So he brings a lot of important things to the table, in that he has legal expertise, he has policy experience, he has a good network, and he and I have a great relationship because we've been friends ever since we worked for the Department of Energy together. We also bring in a lot of subject matter experts to supplement our abilities. And so we have a pretty sizable budget that is allocated to that. But I think from our perspective, it wouldn't make sense to hire. Sometimes we need additional lawyers. Sometimes we need people who are specialists in grant writing. Sometimes we need people who are specialists on a specific piece of legislation or rulemaking activity. And so from that perspective, it makes sense for us to understand what our needs, to have sort of a quiver of contractors that we can draw upon, or not necessarily contractors. Sometimes it's other companies or specialty consultancies that we can draw upon when we have a project that is going to be a little bit larger than Matt and I will be able to handle ourselves. And then we do bring on really great interns and part-time help when necessary during the summers and things like that. But for now, we have a relatively small team. It's two of us. I would say small but mighty, because we have actually been pretty effective in achieving the things that we sought out to do over the past couple of years.
What's on the radar next for Ample?
So I think the first step is to get those high mileage vehicles electrified. And that means your Ubers, your Lyfts, your taxis, your delivery vehicles. There's another benefit to starting with those kinds of vehicles, which is their routes are relatively predictable. We know where they're going to go. We know where they're going to come back to. And more or less, we understand what the mileage requirements are for those various kinds of vehicles. And so that means that we can establish an infrastructure footprint that serves those fleet vehicles extremely well without having to carpet the entire country with Ample swapping stations from day one. So that's a big help in terms of our initial rollout. Now, our goal is to build out that fleet infrastructure and use those fleets, because for them having this ability to repower electrically quickly, it's extremely valuable, but also kind of use them as our beta testers and make sure that we have a product that is extremely user-friendly, that is extremely powerful in terms of the speed and the ease and the economics with which we can repower electric vehicles, and then eventually open up all of that infrastructure to consumers. And I think that that's the second stage of Ample's development.
And do you see it as a future where battery swapping will still work with traditional EV charging, other solutions too? Like, is it a winner takes all? Is it going to be everybody?
Yeah, I wouldn't want it any other way. I wouldn't want to buy an electric vehicle that didn't have a plug on it, because personally, I love the idea of being able to go home at night, plug into my home garage, have a solar panel installed on my roof, and wake up every day with a full battery. I think that sounds terrific. It's just so many people don't have that as an option. I don't have it as an option. I've never had it as an option. I grew up in Denver. We street parked where I grew up. And then I moved to New Haven and I street parked there. And then I moved back to Denver and I moved to Switzerland and I moved to San Francisco. And every single place that I've lived, I have never had a place where I would be able to plug in an electric car. And I finally just bit the bullet when I bought my last vehicle. And I said, I'm going electric regardless. But public recharging infrastructure, it's just not practical for the vast majority of Americans.
Chris Sacca at Lower Carbon Capital, he said that he had an allergy to working with Washington at a recent conference about 2 weeks ago. And I'm wondering, for someone like you that has to straddle Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and DC, what does he get right or wrong about a statement like that?
I'd like to see Chris Sacca's portfolio because, quite frankly, it's imperative to work with Washington. And if you don't work with Washington, you're not going to get anything done in the clean energy space. None of these industries that are the lifeblood of the clean tech space today would exist without the heavy intervention of Washington. And that starts with R&D programs at places like the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy manages the National Lab system. Places like Argonne National Lab and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, they developed the solar cells and a lot of the battery technology that inhabits the electric vehicles and the rooftop solar panels that we use today. Next, you go to industrial policy, where the US government and other governments around the world are pumping money into these technologies at an early stage where they're just not economical. And sometimes that comes from the defense side, where either the military or maybe the space program is paying for these capabilities in strange environments where they're valuable for some reason. But a lot of the time, it just comes from politicians and policymakers who have a little bit of foresight saying, hey, someday this is going to be really valuable. This is going to be worth it for us to spend this money now, even if it's wildly uneconomical today. And what you can see is those investments have produced a steadily declining cost curve for every single one of these technologies: solar, wind, LED lighting, electric vehicles. And finally, these technologies don't make it to market unless you have pretty strong regulatory pressure at the end of the day. Some of that comes from places like the California Air Resource Board. Some of it comes from the Environmental Protection Agency. Some of it comes from the Department of Transportation. So I'd love to get a little bit more background on that quote from Chris Sacca, but it sounds, and I don't want to believe this, but it sounds like he doesn't understand the industry that he's working in. So I would be happy to chat with him about it and maybe educate him about the important role that policy has played in building up the clean tech sector.
That's fair. Maybe we'll do another chat, all three of us.
Absolutely, I'm down.
You brought up a little bit too about bringing on, newer folks in the industry. Sometimes you bring on interns to help out with Ample in the summers. I mean, what advice would you have for younger people when they want to make their mark within clean tech or even electric mobility? Like, what advice do you have for them?
Well, I think it's really important to find a mentor, to figure out what you're passionate about, and then do whatever you can to get an early job or a first job working with someone who understands the space that you want to inhabit and you want to thrive in, and who you can learn a craft from, who you can get advice from, and who you can visit over the years and bounce ideas off of. I had a great mentor when I was getting into the energy space, who interestingly was not a clean tech guy at all, but he was a towering figure in the energy industry. His name is Daniel Yergin, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He wrote a book called The Prize that is still one of the best books on energy ever written. And I think probably the only book on energy that's ever won a Pulitzer Prize. And I worked for him while I was a PhD student for about 5 years. I was his research assistant and writing assistant. And he taught me really important things about not only how to write and how to research, but also how to think about the world. And that was something that it was important for me because I knew I wanted to change the energy industry, but I felt in order to be a force changing the energy industry and pushing for decarbonization, I had to understand the existing industries. So studying at the feet of this guy who is kind of a god to many in the oil sector was extremely helpful in understanding where I should be pointed.
What does he think of you now? Do you keep up with him of all your activities?
We're great friends. I see him all the time. When I wrote my book, I dedicated it to my father, my grandfather, and my mentor, who is Dan Yergin. So we've maintained a good relationship over the years, and we understand that we disagree on certain things. And fortunately, that doesn't impact our interpersonal relationship.
Yeah. Is another book on the horizon for you?
Maybe. I've been thinking about it.
Okay. What's keeping you up at night?
What's keeping me up at night? That's a good question. I think a lot about carbon capture and storage. We are rapidly overshooting the limits for CO2 emissions. And so what that means is we're going to have to build a massive industry that essentially does the opposite of what we're doing today. Today, we burn fossil fuels and we emit those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Tomorrow, we're going to have to build an even bigger industry that pulls those greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and finds ways to condense and store them. Geologically, most likely, or potentially turning them into different kinds of materials. We can also store them in the soils. We can store them in biomass. There are a number of different ways that we can pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hopefully keep it in the ground so as to reduce our cumulative impact on the climate. That's a huge challenge. It's something that fascinates me. It's something that, again, is going to be completely driven by policy. It's not going to happen on its own. And you can already see a bunch of fledgling companies that are doing really cool work in the space today. So I think that that's probably what keeps me up at night.
Yeah. And I know it's really early days too in that space. Are there any companies that are standing out to you of ones that you're following?
Oh, there are a bunch. There are a bunch. I don't want to misname them because I'll probably get the name slightly wrong if I say it. So I'm not gonna do that. But there are a couple out of Cambridge that grew out of MIT that are working on what's called direct air capture, where you literally just pull the carbon from the air and you distill it into a liquid, and then you find ways to transport that liquid and to store that carbon. There are companies that are working on what's called BECCS, which is bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration, where you literally grow crops and then you burn those crops, most likely to generate electricity or heat or something like that. And then you take the carbon that you have now condensed from those crops that you've burnt and you catch it as it is being, as it's being emitted. And then you maybe pump it back into the earth and store it in a geological formation or something like that. There's something called accelerated weathering, where you basically mix carbon dioxide with basalt, kind of rock that will react chemically with carbon dioxide and can store that carbon dioxide permanently, essentially. So there are lots of cool companies that are operating in this space. And, I haven't actually studied the specifics of the industry for a while. I'm more interested in the technology, but I can get back with you on some names if that's helpful.
Yeah, I'm just always curious, always wanting to learn more of what stands out to you. All right, so we're coming close to our time here together. I do have a couple more questions I want to ask, or kind of like a fast round of questions. I recruited some questions from my team, and they were wondering, if you thought that what would happen first at scale, flying cars or self-driving vehicles?
Well, I think both of those are an interesting case because it's not an on-off button, right? And I would say, especially with self-driving vehicles, it's not an on-off button. It's a spectrum, right? So, rather than going from black to white or white to black, you're going to see a lot of shades of gray. And that's actually what we see in the industry today. So from that perspective, self-driving vehicles are definitely going to come first. When it comes to flying cars, I think the question is, what is what is a flying car? Is a helicopter a flying car? Is a quadricopter a self-flying? A flying car. There are all these different incarnations of flying cars that could potentially qualify, but is it one of those things where it when you see it? I don't really know. I think that there are going to be a lot of cool new, most likely what are called VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing craft that are developed over the coming years. And I'm excited for it. I've been watching that space for a long time. I think the challenge is regulatory. The challenge is what happens when one of these vehicles crash. Likely they're going to have to be autonomous or have autonomous potential to deal with those eventualities. But then you get a whole other set of issues, which is related to security and potentially terrorism. What if someone takes over a flying car that has autonomous capabilities and slams it into a building or something? That's not good, right? So all of a sudden our security threats are in 3 dimensions rather than 2 dimensions. And I think that we're going to have to think really long and hard before flying cars are a major component of our transportation system. I
think it's fair. And when I see launches like that, I'm like, why? Why do we need that? There's so many problems in the world to solve. Is that something we need to solve for right now?
Yeah, I mean, autonomy in some form is probably faster than flying cars. And I think it's probably more useful than flying cars. That said, full autonomy is going to be a lot harder than we thought. Full autonomy is going to take a long time. And I don't expect to see, what they would call a level 5 autonomous vehicle that can perform in all and any circumstances for a long time to come. When I was driving up to my grandma's this weekend, I was driving through just driving rain. And I thought to myself, no autonomous vehicle is going to be able to deal with this for many decades. And I would stand by that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And so I'm also curious too, as we wrap up here, we always read about doom and gloom and such terrible stories, but I'm just wondering if what you're optimistic about, where do you feel like there's hope?
I'm actually really optimistic about Washington, D.C. right now, which I know is kind of a crazy thing to say, but we had just an incredibly transformative couple of years in Washington, D.C. We had some really huge bipartisan wins. We had some really huge partisan wins, which, I would include the Inflation Reduction Act in that was by far the largest climate bill ever passed. And quite frankly, it's much larger than most people are reporting on, because there are many, many provisions that are intended to use government capital to leverage huge amounts of private sector investment. And so a $10 billion investment may actually turn into $60 billion of investment in the clean energy space, because the government can act as a guarantor of certain kinds of loans. The government can add certain incentives to deploy technologies that may be 85% or 95% of the way to being economical, but they need that extra 10% in order to break even. And so what you're going to see is a lot of money coming off of the sidelines over the next 5 or 10 years and being invested in ways and in places that otherwise wouldn't have happened without this Inflation Reduction Act. And so I am really excited. I am really enthusiastic. I think it is also written in such a way that is going to bring good jobs back to the United States. And it's going to create real constituencies for clean energy in the working class. And we need that. We need to have a working class that isn't just shopping at Walmart, but that is invested in the success of our country and in the transformation to clean energy. And so I see this Inflation Reduction Act as an audacious win for the country, not just for the Democratic Party, but for all of us.
Oh, Levi, I feel like that's such a mic drop right there. But was there anything I should have asked you today that we didn't get to talk about?
No, I have enjoyed it as always, Meg. It's great to see you. And when I'm back in San Francisco, let's go surfing or something.
Oh yes, down. I'm so down. Yeah. Well, Levi, I want to thank you again so much. I think the biggest takeaway that I'm taking here from our conversation is there's hope. Working with DC works. And for anyone who's, perhaps unfortunately maybe like out of the industry right now, based on recent layoffs, like come work in climate tech, because it sounds like there's so many opportunities, electric vehicles, mobility, climate capture, like the list goes on and on. So thank you, Levi. I honestly can't thank you enough.
Thanks for having me, Maggie.
All right, perfect. I'll catch you later.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. A few quick shout outs before you go. Our thanks to Levi Tillemann from Ample for sharing his deep experience in the world of EVs with us. You can find more from Levi on Twitter @LeviTD. This episode was edited by Ray Rangel with production support from Celine DeStasio. To visit any part of today's conversation again, you can find the full transcript on vscventures.com. Our thanks to Josue Ramiro for editing and posting those every week. Lastly, if you've listened this far, please leave us a 5-star rating on Spotify or review on iTunes. It only takes a few seconds, really helps us out, and as far as I know, still carbon neutral. That's it for now. We'll see you next week on Climb by VSC.